reducing their assets so they could live together in harmony? Not mentioned. They quarreled, they argued, they created conflict, and it went downhill from there. As the story continues all the way on through, the children of Israel end up in Egypt. Egypt is fabulously wealthy. They cry out to God. God delivers them through a series of 10 mills that caused harm to Egypt. Eventually Egypt said, take our gold, take our valuables, go somewhere else. We don't want you here anymore. So they loaded up Israel with all of their stuff. And Israel took off over the Red Sea, and Egypt pursued them, chased them down, and they ended up with this grand conflict. They crossed by Mount Sinai. God gave them the law. They came up to the edge of the Jordan River. They didn't have enough faith to believe that God could get them in. They wandered for 40 years, all of that generation dying along the way, until they come back to the edge of the Jordan River. The next generation, young people, are now growing older, and their forebears, their forefathers, had all passed away because of their lack of faith, their lack of obedience. Moses is now a very elderly man. And in the book of Deuteronomy, he explains to this new generation what God has said. They weren't there at the time. All of these people were born on the way. And Moses describes in one book, Deuteronomy, their background, their identity, and the law, and how they are to live it out. In Deuteronomy, chapters 1 through 4, Moses explains a very, very brief history of going to Egypt, crying out to God, God delivering them getting back. In chapters 5 through 14, he comes to Mount Sinai, gets the 10 Commandments, understands the law that is given to Israel, primarily the emphasis of Moses, now as an old man, over and over in these 6 or 7 chapters, is of the Lord your God. Fall in love with God. Understand his passionate desire for you. He makes promises, he brings benefits, his blessing is unparalleled, but in every way love the Lord your God. He says it over and over and over and over. When you keep the Sabbath day, when you give your when you do this, do it because you love the Lord. It's an amazing statement. He doesn't talk about murder, he doesn't talk about any of the other 10 Commandments. He only talks about love the Lord your God and have no other God before you. And then comes Deuteronomy 15, and the very first set of commandments after the primary law to love the Lord your God is deal with debt. That's how important this is as God leads his people. They're now ready to step into the promised land. He's going to give it to them. He's going to give them the land. He's going to do an absolute miracle in their life. That's what we believe we're in the middle of. We're in the middle of a miracle. We have no idea how it's going to happen. We try to figure numbers, crunch this, crunch that. We look at all of it, and then it's like, this is impossible. It's never going to happen. But the children of Israel were in exactly the same place when they stood on the east side of the Jordan River, getting ready to cross over. Their parents had failed, but they had faith. Under Joshua and Caleb, they were going in to take the land. And as God explains to them, through Moses, how they are to live, there's a brief history, love the Lord your God, and then deal with debt. Don't let there be poor among you. I know that's going to happen, but don't allow it to happen in your generation. It's an amazing statement. This issue of debt is not only a modern issue, it is an ancient issue as well. There are 4 presumptions that we must make when we take on debt in our own lives or in our church. These are 4 presumptions that allow us, or when we enter into a debt obligation, we must hold in our mind as true. Presumption number 1, the future is certain to provide what we need for our debt. We assume that we will be able to earn that money eventually. That in the future, the path, the circumstances, our job situation, all of that is, we are confident that that is safe and secure and will pay off the debt. It's a presumption that we make. Because if we didn't have that presumption, we'd never enter into the debt. The future, we assume, is sure. Secondly, we assume that the asset for which we are entering a debt is worth the debt and won't decline. One of the problems with buying a car is that immediately upon driving it off the showroom floor, it's worth less than when you first sat in it. It's a declining value asset. If you keep a car long enough, it's worth basically nothing at all. And yet you're still paying on it. If you have an accident and your insurance isn't enough to pay off the debt, you have a crashed car that's actually not working at all, and you still have to continue making payments. But the assumption is the asset that we go into debt for is going to be worth the debt. One of the frightening things in modern American society is the debt load taken on by students to get their education. That we assume an education is worth it. When Pam and I went to school, we graduated from college, 4-year degree, with $16,000 in debt. We could get a job that would pay that off in a couple of years, no big deal. But now, a student graduating from college can incur easily somewhere between $80,000 and $150,000, and that's not even a big ticket thing like Shannon's getting. To be a medical doctor, I mean, it's $250,000 just to be able to complete school. And if you look at it and say, is the asset of the education actually going to be worth it? Well, yeah, if you're going to be a brain surgeon, yes. But if you want to work among the poor and work in a clinic, you end up with an education for which you can never pay it off. But the assumption is the asset is going to be worth the debt. The third presumption is that I cannot live below my means now. I worded that very carefully. I am not able to live below my means now. I must have this object. Go out for dinner, go on vacation, I buy a house. I cannot live below my means. I have to have that and I can't afford it right now. So I borrow in order to be able to have that item, and I cannot live below what I earn at this point in my life. And here is the grand fourth assumption. I will be able to live below my means in the future. Because I'll have to have what I earn and put it into debt retirement. I'll have to pay off my debt. So you'll have a means to live, but you'll have to live less than that in order to pay off that debt. So that becomes an interesting set of presumptions, especially the last two. I cannot live below my means now, but I'll be able to change my nature after I incur the debt. Which is one of the reasons why so many have fallen into tremendous difficulty. In Romans chapter 12 through 15, this verse is embedded in the middle of 4 chapters. Paul in Romans 1 through 8 has explained the Roman road for salvation, what it means to be in a right relationship with Jesus Christ. In chapters 9, 10, and 11, he explains the conflict between how could God make promises to Israel that now apply to the church, and how do we deal with who is really chosen and what does it mean. That was a big conflict in the world. But then he addresses those who are securely believers, who actually have made a commitment to Jesus Christ and are beginning to walk that journey with him. In Romans chapter 12 through 15, he creates an entire countercultural view. He says, I know the world tells you to live this way. This is how people do it in the Roman world of our day. But over and over and over, he says, do not live that way. Don't take your cues from the way it does what it does. Think differently. Live differently. It starts out in chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Let your mind be transformed. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind through the Holy Spirit. When he gets to this chapter, in chapter 13, he begins to deal with the issue of how do we oblige ourselves? To what will we commit? Not just in terms of our religion, but in terms of the course of our life. How do we make choices to commit? Now, Paul was an incredibly wise person. He makes a simple statement, and ultimately the simple statement has to do with this nature of debt. But he also, in the Roman world, he traveled all over. And one of the grand concepts of the collapse of the Roman world was they created an unsustainable model with an unsustainable debt. Even in the day of Paul, taxes were escalating not only on the third world of Rome, but on the first world of Rome. And there are records from individuals alive at the time of Paul writing to the Senate of Rome, complaining about the taxation upon the wealthy, and that the wealthy should be exempt from certain levels of taxation because they are the ones actually sustaining the empire. And should Rome tax the resources, they will collapse and Rome will collapse. And that was what was being said at Paul's time. Now, he may not have known about that, but Paul was an incredibly astute individual who was very well traveled and very well read. When he says to the Christian, don't have a debt other than the debt to love. Live outside even the Roman system. Owe nothing to nobody. What's really interesting, the New International says, let no debt remain. And the main verb is remain. But in the original language, it's be obliged or carry obligations to absolutely no one for nothing. He uses double negative. Paul is emphatic. Your obligation is to love. To be free to oblige yourself to relationships, to commitments that matter, to things that are eternal, to things that are spiritual. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. And he gives 4 commandments, which are the last 4 commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not covet. Any other commandment is summed up in this rule: love your neighbor as yourself. So this becomes the 5th promise to us. Does it mean we can't incur debt? We may have to. But we must do that step with great wisdom and foundation as we move forward. But I am convinced that God will provide as long as we are faithful to His word. However, it's not only a word to us as a corporate church, it's a word to us as individuals as well. How can we live with no obligation except to love one another?